All right. Hello. My name is Chris Kirkwood. I'm a bass player of the Meat Puppets, and I'm from Arizona. I'm not really from Arizona officially. I wasn't born here. I was born in Texas, but wound up in Arizona, I think about 65. I was pretty young when we got here. And we wound up in Phoenix because my mother, Vera's second husband, was a furrier by trade, a horseshoer, and we were on the thoroughbred circuit in the Southwest, and wound up here pretty much because of Turf Paradise, in a way, and then eventually wound up with our own thoroughbreds, wound up with our own stalls down there, had our own paddock, whatever it's called down there, our own batch of stalls and everything down at Turf Paradise. And we wound up moving to Sunny Slope and grew up right on the corner, right on the northeast corner of 15th Avenue in Butler. So that meant that, let's see, by the time I got here, I was young enough. I actually went to Rancho Solano kindergarten up on Dunlap. And then I started grade school, and I went from 1st through 8th grade to Royal Palm on 19th and Butler. And so did my brother go to Royal Palm as well, my brother Kurt, who's the guitar player in the Meat Puppets. And let's see, then I started high school in 74, and I would have, because of where I lived, gone to Sunny Slope, but Mom thought she would prefer us to go to Brophy. So Kurt and I both went to Brophy College Prep on Central, and both of us graduated from there. And before I actually started Brophy, Kurt had an assignment to read Clockwork Orange by Anthony Burgess. And right around that time, the film had come out, the Stanley Kubrick film of the same name. And the folks at Brophy, one of his teachers, his English teacher, I would assume, had suggested that if everybody wanted to, they could go see the new Clockwork Orange, the film. So Mom took Kurt and I to see A Clockwork Orange, and it was back when they had double features, and the other film playing along with it was Deliverance. So at the time, I was about 12, I think, at that point. And they had that scene in there in Deliverance, speaking of music, they had the scene in there where the kid comes out, the hillbilly kid, and plays a little banjo in there with Ronnie Cox, remember that sequence? And I was just smitten by the banjo at that point, and I set about getting a banjo, and got one up at McClarty Music in Sunny Slope. So, and I still have that banjo, oddly enough, considering, how easy it is to lose things, and I still have that same banjo, and I wrote on it as a kid, "Close your mouth," because I used to sit there practicing with my tongue hanging out, So just kind of charming, considering I still have it. And before that, I had guitar lessons as a kid, and the guy would actually come to the house, or instructor, and I just didn't like it. It didn't take, I wasn't that interested in it. And then I took piano lessons, and that was up at McClarty's as well. And I kind of liked that a little bit more, but I wasn't, that dedicated to it, definitely. And I liked the instructor there. He was an older gentleman, and he would kind of get tired during our lessons. He'd actually nod off, because he was kind of elderly. So I'd sit there and I'd be playing, and I'd notice, oh, he's nodding off, so I'd play a little quieter, and then I'd stop, as he sat there. And then he'd kind of come to, and I'd be like, ding, ding, because I didn't really practice that much. So that I didn't take either. But the banjo actually caught my interest. I was taking some lessons up at McClarty, and my instructor, whose name I can't remember, unfortunately, would record the lessons on cassette, and I would take them home. And it was a bluegrass banjo that I was playing, where you use a thumb pick and then two finger picks. And there's a lot of, in bluegrass banjo, there's a lot of pull-ons or pull-offs and roll-ons and stuff, and hammer-ons, that kind of thing. And then there's also that grace note, it's 5-string banjo, you know, and playing it, practicing, was a little difficult, you know, to get it to, I mean, it was just tough, but I stuck at it. And, you know, I listened to his versions of how the song's supposed to go and then sit there and do it. But plucking along at first, it didn't sound like anything. It was kind of disjointed in a way, you know, where you're like, and it wasn't quite making sense. And then just one day, and I mean, I really clearly remember this moment because it was just, I mean, it turned out to be so influential in my whole life. Where I was sitting there and I'd been practicing it for a while, I'd been playing it for quite a while, or, you know, 6 months at least or something. And just all of a sudden it went, you know, and the combination of like the hammer on and the pull off and the grace note and everything went, you know, it sounded musical. And I suddenly realized, okay, this is how this works. And it just blew my head open in a way, you know, like at that moment, it was just like, whoa, you know, it made me realize so much like about myself, you know, the ability to teach yourself things, you know, how your mind works in a way, and about other people, you know, people's desire to play music. They're having created these types of musics, you know, how music's come out of certain regions and people needed to make noise, a certain kind of, you know, certain noise, music, and actually create these instruments to do it with. And it was just a real eye-opener, you know, really kind of knocked my socks off. And I kept doing that for a while, played the banjo, and I still do, for a few more years there. And then at a point, I started thinking that basses looked neat. So I set about getting a bass. I decided, you know, that it just seemed like, you know, having played the banjo using my fingers like that, that it'd be kind of a natural progression to go over to the bass, playing it like that, like a lot of players do. And there were only 4 strings on it, which is a plus. And they were thicker and farther apart, you know. It just seemed like I would be able to kind of, you know, pick it up relatively easily. And I just thought they were neat looking. I just thought they were cool looking, you know. It's kind of taken by that, and wound up getting a bass out at Arizona Music Center out in Glendale, and part of the what was it? The finance agreement. I financed the thing. I was about 15, I think. 15, maybe close to 16. Part of the, you know, when I financed the guitar through the shop, and it was a jazz bass that I wound up with. I was actually kind of taken with the Music Man that had come out at that point, you know, Leo Fender's company that he'd just gotten off the ground at that point. And I thought those basses were real neat, and I had my eye on this one Sunburst, cool looking guitar. And when I went in to get it, the salesman, and you know, told me, well, this other one's going to have more resale value, you know, and it didn't even click at all. I was just like, whatever, you know, I like kind of got bamboozled a little bit. Guy wanted to unload this jazz bass, so I wound up getting a Fender jazz bass instead, you know, and realized later, wait, it's resale. Oh, you mean like I'll stop doing this and then I can sell it later and it'll have more, you know, be worth more. But it, you know, and that influenced like the way I play and everything. Who knows what would happen if I got that other Music Man instead of that one at that point. I eventually wound up getting one a few years later. But so I got this jazz bass, and part of the finance agreement was that I would take lessons from an instructor there at the shop. So I did. I had, and he still teaches in town, Raul Tapia, and I think he still gives lessons over at Ziggy's. I saw him just a few years ago, still around, and it was real helpful. That was actually really helpful, and it was kind of like supposedly like jazz improv lessons or something. But I mean, it didn't get that far. I didn't, you know, to the point that I could improvise on jazz, other than like, you know, saying that I could. But he taught me like the neck. You know, I learned all the notes. You know, learned like 1-4-5 kind of stuff. You know, some real simple stuff that just kind of was foundational. And I took that that was probably about, I think, like maybe 3 months that I took lessons, and then I just kind of struck out on my own with the instrument. And all through all that, my brother Kurt had kind of been playing the guitar. So, and we weren't all that close. Like we didn't, you know, I mean, we did stuff together definitely. We were close. We shared a bedroom, you know. But I mean, it was for sure my big brother. He was the kind of big brother that would like unscrew the light bulb and then reach out from under the bed and grab me by the ankle. You know, I thought it was just like, ah, horrifying. You know, kind of a big brother. He's 22 months older than me. So we did stuff, but we weren't, you know, tight, and there was never any like, you know, we want to be in a band, you know, we want to, you know, let's form a band together. There was never anything like that. But he'd been playing guitar kind of all along, you know. He took like bebop lessons up at McClarty's Music, you know, and I think Joe McClarty, I think it was, well, Mr. McClarty had been a contemporary of like Barney Kessel and guys like that, you know. So Kirk got a little bit of a background in bebop guitar and stuff, and then just kind of kept playing it, and at a point, you know, he was going through what he was going through and got more serious about the guitar in a way, or just, you know, just grew. It was at that point where he got to a, you know, kind of a place with it. And through a mutual friend, we met Derek Bostrom. And Kurt and Derek started playing together. And Derek was a real interesting guy and very influential on Kurt and I. And we were influential back on him. You know, we were more musician-y in a way, and he was more of a conceptualist, you know, an artist even, you know, and had set about to become the world's worst drummer. You know, when we met him, he had a kick drum with a cymbal screwed into the top, a rickety hi-hat, and he taught himself to play open-handed, you know, rather than, you know, most drummers cross, you know, like that, and he taught himself like that, you know, and it was just really, really simplistic, and it wasn't about, like, you know, being a drummer, you know, and there was a lot of that back in the 70s with guys like Bill Bruford, you know, and Billy Cobham, you know, guys that are really, really technically accomplished. But Derek had been, you know, he was aware of and into the punk scene that, you know, from its inception, really. So he turned Kurt and I onto a lot of stuff that I hadn't really been exposed to. I mean, because of the 7-inch thing that had happened with the punk rock thing, you know. So, and after those guys had been playing for a little while, they decided to ask me if I'd like to come over and play a little bit of bass with them. And a lot of us played, you know, at that point, you know, this is getting into our late teens, you know, so we're experimenting with, not experimenting, I mean, we're avidly using, you know, pot and psychedelics and whatnot, you know, and so a lot of us played, and, you know, there were these little groups that would get together, just, you know, depending on who's there and playing and whatnot. But when the three of us played, there was just something about it that was very intoxicating, and that was the start of the band. And that would have been about sometime in the fall, early winter of '79. And Kurt and I had different tastes than Derek did. So, I mean, at that point, you know, my biggest influence was my brother and Derek, definitely. But having, you know, come up as a player, having been from Phoenix, you know, having been, you know, I got into it as much as anything as a fan of music, you know. So I was really into bluegrass, you know, as a kid. And that led me into like indigenous musics in a way, you know, kind of figure out where did the bluegrass come from, how did this happen, you know, and how the bluegrass has, it's like an American instrument, one of the few instruments actually, you know, derived out of the States, and part of that is the drum, you know, which is like the African talking drum kind of a thing, you know, has the drum head on there, but then with like European chromaticism and stuff, you know, so I kind of started to dig around into indigenous music a little bit, and then just realized, oh, there's a whole world of music, you know, just, you know, I was pretty young, you know, just starting to discover this stuff. So started getting into like jazz then, you know, started getting into out jazz and kind of further out stuff. And there was, what was his name, Charles Bird? There was a guy that used to put on shows, you know, jazz stuff, and brought neat stuff to town, you know, down at like Neeb Hall at ASU. And so I got a chance to see some pretty neat stuff like Sun Ra, you know, all sorts of stuff. Got into stuff like that. As a kid, you know, when Kurt and I were young, we were, you know, when we were real young, I clearly remember being small enough to be walking between my grandmother and my mom, holding each of their hands and singing, "I Want to Hold Your Hand." So, I mean, the Beatles were the first, you know, thing, like they were for so many people, you know. And then, you know, as I got a little bit older and started to discover stuff, some of the rock stuff that was happening, I wasn't that into it, you know, stuff that I eventually came back to once I got a little more comfortable with myself. But when I was younger, it just seemed, you know, I just wasn't that cool, you know, like, you know, to where it's like the rock thing that was happening at that point in the 70s. So, but I came to rock and roll through like the Grateful Dead, you know, Zappa. I think I was kind of a, you know, I think I used music snobbishness as a shield, you know, kind of as like, you know, to kind of, you know, my identity or whatever, you know, I like this, you know, oh, you like rock and roll, well, that's, you know, I'm into, you know, loftier things or whatever, you know, it's just, for what I've heard is that Kurt Cobain came and saw us like in the early 80s, you know, when on one of the tours or several of the tours, that maybe one of the ones that we were with Black Flag, we toured with those guys a lot because we were on SST, their label, through a lot of the 80s, and we toured with those guys a bunch, and we toured a lot when we were younger, you know, so just from what I've heard, you know, apparently came to some of those shows and was into all that stuff, into the SST stuff, just in the American underground that was happening at that point. But I didn't know them at all, you know, then. Became aware of them when they started to, you know, when they were around as a band, and then saw, you know, when they got signed and stuff like that, because friends of mine were really into them, like Sonic Youth was really into them, and, you know, started to become aware of Seattle as it started to develop a pretty vibrant scene. And a lot of those people we wound up playing with, I remember Mother Love Bone opened for us one time, the precursor to Pearl Jam, you know, those guys, or precursor, whatever, the predecessors of, or some of the band members of that band went on to start Pearl Jam. Soundgarden opened for us back then, you know, but we never played with Nirvana before they got as popular as they did, before that Nevermind blew up. But once that happened, we started hearing, you know, them saying nice things about us, and, you know, a lot of the guys that we'd come up with and stuff. So, and then they just asked us if we'd like to go out and play some shows with them. So that happened, and we did a couple of different tours with them. And by then they were, you know, they were like the biggest band in the world pretty much by that point, you know. So there was all arena shows and stuff like that, you know, sold out, you know, just big timey rock kind of stuff. And got to know them then, you know, got to know the guys in the band then. And one of those nights somewhere, Toronto, somewhere, we were just hanging out after the show, and they were getting ready to do their Unplugged, MTV Unplugged sessions, and Cobain brought up the idea that he wanted to play some of our old stuff on there, so stuff off of Meat Puppets 2, and, you know, we were amenable to the idea, you know, it's like, oh, go ahead, you know, they're pretty easy, it's like, you know, so then that led to he just decided, rather than bother, you know, figuring out the guitar, you know, it's kind of like, well, you know, Kurt can show, our Kurt, whatever, can show, you know, their Kurt how to do the guitar stuff and whatnot, and then he just decided that he would take Kurt and I on there with him and do it like that, you know, so. And we were happy to do it, you know, definitely, you know, because it was punk rocky, you know, it was cool. I mean, it's like rock and roll, you know, it's like not that uptight, you know, it's like, you know, music in general, you know, it's like supposed to be for, you know, it's fun. It's like I got into this on purpose, you know. I went to Brophy, you know, I could have been a dentist, you know. So, you know, it was like, you know, it resonated with that kind of, yeah, that's cool, you know, what a neat idea, you know, take us on there. Just as far as like musically, you know, playing with other people is kind of a cool idea, and then to use, you know, his newfound, you know, popularity to, you know, shove the Meat Puppets down people's throats. Pretty cool idea too, you know. And oddly enough, not oddly enough, but you know, the MTV people weren't into it. They like tried to have him, you know, make him not bring us on TV with him, and he was, you know, powerful enough, you know, popular enough to force them to let us, you know, go on there and do it, which is very cool. And that was only supposed to be, that was just going to be it was just going to be the Unplugged. It wasn't going to be an album, you know, at that point. But unfortunately, you know, Kurt, you know, took his life. So they decided then after that to release it, you know, and it's incredible the life that it has. It's incredible how, you know, how far-reaching it's gotten. You know, I did a thing a couple of years ago. We went to Australia, and they asked me to pick some videos, like pick 5 videos and talk about them, right? And it's like, you know, I didn't know what to, you know, it's promo stuff, right? So I decided, well, talk about me, you know, talk about us. So I decided to do a little thing. It was like the evolution of a song, and talked about the song Lake of Fire, which is one of the ones we played on there with Nirvana. And I said, you know, like, I think I was probably like the second guy to hear the song after my brother, who wrote it, right? Heard it first in his head or whatever, and then he wrote the thing. And I remember clearly, you know, I got a new song, you know, him playing it for me, and it's like, that's really neat. And then I showed a video, and I said, then we recorded it and put it on, you know, and I played that video, right, where they just show the album cover and the song plays the album version. Then I said, then we played it a lot as kids, found a video of us young playing it. And then I said, you know, then Nirvana wanted to cover it. We went on TV and played that, and then I put that was the 3rd video. And then because of that, the song, you know, just went out to the world, all the more. And I got online, and there's like 100,000 versions of it or something. There's some ridiculous amount of like people covering the song, right? So found a video of these kids in like, you know, Lithuania or somewhere, you know, there's 12-year-olds kids doing it, you know, and it said, you know, now it's, you know, it's gone out to the degree that it's like a year's worth of the song on you know, on YouTube that you can, you know, so many versions of it. And played that as the 4th video, and then I said, you know, we're still doing the song, and played an older version of it, you know. So, you know, looking back now, punk rock definitely allowed me to be in a band, you know, to play live music, you know. I think punk, you know, like in a broader sense, that's what punk was, a reaction to that big time rock, you know, which is like, I just couldn't envision myself up there, you know, like that. So, you know, scale it down a little bit. It doesn't matter how good you can play, whatever. You know, punk rock's just like, it's just the doing of it. You know, it's like, oh, and having an outlet for that. You know, and so that, you know, gave me that ability, gave us that ability. But then we brought all this other musicality to it as well. You know, so I think we were kind of, especially once we got out of town, started getting out into the punk rock scene, we started having a little bit more of a, you know, a presence, or national, you know, kind of a thing or whatever, getting out in different scenes, Los Angeles in particular, you know. I think we were kind of the guys that, you know, made it okay in the punk rock scene to say that you like the Grateful Dead, kind of, you know, that kind of a thing. And definitely, musically, we were affected by it, by, you know, where we'd come from. On our first album, we, you know, we did, most of the songs are our own, but we also included on there a cover of the Sons of the Pioneers, Tumblin' Tumbleweeds, you know, a song that we'd gotten off our mom, driving along singing. She and Kurt used to drive along. We'd drive along, take road trips, and Kurt and Mom would sing. And then we also did a Walkin' Boss, which we'd gotten off of Doc Watson, you know. And then our second album, Meat Puppets 2, is definitely heavily influenced by, you know, like Neil Young, stuff like that, you know. And it was a bit of a musical departure from the first album, stylistically, but it was the next logical progression for us, definitely, and us, you know, breaking out of that, like, you know, we're going to be the band that we want to be, you know, we're not going to let anybody else, you know, constrict us or define us. And the punk scene, by that point, had gotten to the point where it was getting, you know, formulaic or rigid, you know, there was these rules, you know, you had to look a certain way, sound a certain way, and we weren't interested in letting that, you know, dictate our direction at all. So,
what was the genesis of the name Meat Puppets?
That was actually a song originally that Kurt wrote, my brother wrote. And you know, we were trying to figure out what to call ourselves. I wanted to call us, I thought the Mustangs would be a good name, because it was like, you know, I won't say where that came from. But you know, we were trying to figure out what to call ourselves. Derek had come up with the Bastions of Immaturity, And Kurt wrote that song, Meat Puppets. It's on Meat Puppets 1. It's on our first album. And it was a very open-ended song. The lyrics are, they go, meat puppets, ... right? And so basically we would say whatever, and I remember one of the lines was, meat puppets eat hydrogenated animal fat, something, you put in whatever there as far as the lyrics on that particular song were concerned. But it's just kind of seemed to fit, it was kind of a cool, the idea behind the song, what the name means, as much as anything. It gets back to that, that John Lennon thing. What are Beatles? What does the name Beatles mean? It means us. We're the Beatles. Same thing with us, the Meat Puppets. Although, at one point, a few years into the band, somebody came up and asked me, does a meat puppet mean your dick? I was like, hey, I hadn't thought of that. It's like, you play with it with your hand, and it's made out of meat. But that's where it came from. Kurt came up with it.
Where were you guys playing around town?
At that point, not a whole lot of places, really. I remember, some of the first stuff we did were just parties. Friends' parties. Parents would go out of town, go over and play at a party. And we did that before we even had a name. I remember we played at a friend of mine's house from grade school, Quinn McQuarrie was his name, and he lived up in Sunny Slope. We went over and played with him. And at the time, we were doing a lot of punk rock covers, because you're asking, what are our influences? How did that affect it? One of the things we found, we could learn these punk rock songs pretty easily and play them pretty easily. So, and Derek was singing most of them at that time. And our friend Quinn announced this. He said, "Ladies and gentlemen, The Rash," which is a pretty good name. It's not bad. So we weren't really doing a whole lot of gigs in town, at that point. There was, parties, and I can't quite recall what the first actual, bar gig or something like that was. Kurt would remember. Kurt would definitely remember, and people to tell you, but I can't quite recall. But it started off definitely more like kind of a punker thing. There was a punk rock thing happening in town at the time.
Who were the local punk rock bands that you listened to and you liked?
There was the Feeders, definitely the Feeders. And before that, and Derek was aware of all this stuff, an interesting story, kind of the way we got out of town and got connected with Los Angeles, which is where all of our records came out of, from the first 7-inch all the way up until we got signed to a major label, and those guys were in New York in 1990. But before that, all of our records came out of Los Angeles. There was a band called The Consumers here in town, and they were one of the very first punk rock bands. And then there was the Exterminators, short-lived punk rock band as well, the Liars, Crazy Homicide. There was just a handful of things. This is going all the way back to 76, 77. And the Consumers had played, and Derek had, this was even before, the band and everything. He had, was up on what was going on, but too young to get into a bar. So it was actually Bart Bull who had written something, I think, in the New Times about the show, and if you weren't there, you weren't cool or something. And Derek had struck communication with him, writing him letters and stuff, and said, well, what if you're too young, and somehow that led Bart to get Derek in touch with David Wiley, who was the singer of The Consumers. And all those guys had moved out to Los Angeles at a point, pretty early on. After having played some shows here, they all decided to take off for L.A. And Derek kept up his communication with David. And once we started playing, Derek was sending him cassettes of us, and that led to us going out to Los Angeles and playing out there and meeting all the folks out, a bunch of different bands that David knew, and kind of getting into the scene out there, including Monitor, the band Monitor. And it was our relationship with them that led to our first 7-inch. So, but before that, the first punk show I went to in town here was Trout-O-Rama. There was a thing, that the punkers did, and it was up at the hall in Sunny Slope, actually. And the bands that played that night, the Feeders, I think, played. You know, it was just the local scene that was happening, you know, and it was a real eye-opener. The Brains played as well. There was another punk rock band, and that's kind of why I wanted to go see it, because I'd heard about this kid, Buzzy Murder was the guitar player, and a guy I'd gone to grade school with knew him, and I was just intrigued by, you know, these guys having their own bands, being that young and stuff, you know, so I went to the Troutorama, and, you know, it was odd this happened. This was kind of, you know, I got a kick out of this just slightly. You know, we were into punk at that point, and suddenly there's a punk show that we could go to in town, and we were all dancing like goofballs, you know, and it was before, it was kind of like pogoing, you know, before like the slam dancing and everything, but it was still physical and fun, and I was young, you know, the next week's issue of the New Times came out, and you know, they had a review of or they mentioned that the show had happened, and they had taken a picture, like, tell it was like taken from stage or something, and I realized, hey, look at there, it's me, Derek, and a bunch of our, you know, all of us, and we're kind of like squished up against each other in the midst of all this little dancing thing, you know. It's like some of our first press, you know, like, hey, you know, and so that was the first show that I went and saw, was the Troutorama, and then they had Exorama, it was another one of the same folks that were putting them on, and it was the folks that, you know, were into punk, and, you know, you do it yourself kind of a thing, you know, find a hall and put on a show, you know, so.
If you could define the music you play today in 3 or 4 words, what would it be?
Not too shabby, you know, you know, or quite shabby, somewhere in between shabby and not too shabby.
Is it much different than when you started?
It's definitely different in that, you know, we're a lot older, you know, so just playing wise, you know, the amount of time we've had on the instruments, the change, you know, physically, you know, we can play stuff from all of the albums, you know, I have quite a few albums, you know, we can touch on any of them pretty much, except we don't really play anything off of Me Puppets 1 or our 7-inch. So, except the covers, we'll occasionally do Walkin' Boss or something like that, you know, but the original is off of those things. Those things don't really get addressed, you know, and I think that's, you know, one of the things that's, you know, that time has wrought. You know, we were so young, and like when we made Me Puppets 1, we dropped 3 days in a row. You know, we'd wake up, dose, and, you know, we did it 3 days in a row because we thought that's what, you know, you're supposed to do. That's what all the cool guys, you know, that's what our heroes do. So those songs, you know, they were just so visceral, you know, we were so young, just screaming our asses off. And I think there's, you know, definitely hints of the direction that we're headed in that they're not just straightforward like punk rock. It's way more just, you know, us expressing ourselves. But they're just as young as we were and as, you know, physical as we were in a way, I think that's a, you know, a change that's taken place. But conceptually, you know, we're still after the same thing. It's that same thing as when I hit that thing on the banjo, you know? It's just like, damn, that's bitching. I want to chase that, you know? I want to feel that again. I want to chase that thing. I want to, you know, and we're still just chasing something, you know, where you're trying to, you know, let the music, you know, play through you and get off on it, you know? It's something I feel really fortunate that, you know, I still love the feel of a guitar in my hands, you know? I just love it, you know. As far as doing it professionally, I mean, you know, forge your own path, you know, have fun doing it. Definitely, it's, you know, it's tough, you know, obviously it's not easy. I certainly never thought that, you know, I'd get to the point that I've gotten to with it. Although you know, we did sit around and purposely, you know, aim ourselves at being able to do it for a long time. And we were careful about that, you know, careful about the content of the songs, not to paint ourselves in any particular corner, you know, so. But to get to the point that we've gotten to, you know, I'm like, you know, it's kind of, you know, it's pretty surprising. So, you know, what will be, but definitely music's a blast, you know, and you know, I can't encourage anybody enough to, you know, not to pick up a guitar, pick up whatever, you know, and have at. Definitely.
What did you do right and what did you do wrong?
I did mostly everything wrong, and I did right by sinking my claws deep into my brother's cape so that I would be drug aloft as he soared skyward. You know, and speaking of new music, I mean, that's the cool thing right now that's going on in the studio here. you know, I'm getting ready to work with some young bands here in town, and you know, through the new label that Tom Lopez has started, Slope Records. It's so cool that this circle that's come back. You know, that's something that's happening right now. I'm going to be producing a band called the Line Cutters in here next week. It's pretty neat.
Is most of your musical focus local these days?
I mean, this stuff that he's doing, it's his label, so you know, he's purposely promoting the local scene, definitely. You know, and he's the guy that released that Exterminators record that I did. You know, that those guys asked me to play bass on because the original bass players passed away. But Tom was the one that afforded them the opportunity to do that because they'd never made an album back then, and he kind of wanted to document the old Phoenix punk rock scene. He was a kid on the punk scene. He's a little younger than I am, so, but he was, you know, right there shortly after, you know, and grew up into the music and stuff. And now he's has the ability to, you know, he's gotten himself to the point where he can start a record label, and he's, you know, and purposely named it Slope, you know, after Sunny Slope, and documenting the stuff that's come before, you know, and then now we're focusing on, you know, new bands in town. And he's asked me to help out, which I'm happy to do. And it's just cool, you know, that the circle had come all the way back around, you know, to where I'm in the position to be able to, you know, lend a little bit of my experience, my enthusiasm, my good looks, you know, to these kids, you know, you know, and just to bolster the next generation, you know, because of the weird circles. I mean, the first live show I ever saw, oddly enough, the first one that I took myself to, you know, when I was like old enough to, you know, I don't know if I was legally able to drive, but I was old enough to know where Mom kept her car keys, and you know, it was Alice Cooper. So, you know, it's just like, you know, it's a Phoenix thing.
Cool. So what keeps you in Arizona?
Poverty. You know, we started touring so young, and you know, part of it, we're just so involved with the band. You know, we're really hell bent. Definitely, you know, we just love doing it, and we played all the time, and we're, you know, so caught up in it when we were younger. And then we started touring, and I started to get to see a lot of the country that I'd never seen before. I'd never been back to the East Coast, you know, fairly well traveled as a kid, just because Mom liked to go road tripping, but you know, got to see a lot more of the country than I had before, and then the world, you know, get out to places I hadn't been before, and just realize, you know, I'm fine here, basically. You know, I know all the streets. I can make it home practically in any condition, you know, and I like it here. You know, I like it. I mean, it's changed a lot. Phoenix has definitely changed. It certainly has grown a lot since when I was a kid. You know, I mean, when I was a kid, I was 10 minutes from raw desert, you know, and that's the middle of town now, you know. So, you know, that's a little shocking how much it's grown, but it makes sense because it's a trippy, cool place, you know. And definitely, this place is in my guts. It's in our bones, you know. Meat Puppets are so much of an Arizona band, so much of Phoenix band, you know, so much of the Sonoran Desert, you know, and of Phoenix, you know, of Wallace and Ladmo, you know, of the Coliseum, you know, just of the desert, and you know, Royal Palm and the Valley of the Sun, you know, and you know, so I'm just you know, where I'm at, you know. And my brother hasn't lived here for a long time, you know. He's lives in Austin. His daughter's out there, but he pines for Phoenix, you know, for Arizona. I know he does in a way, and you know, just because it's home. And thank you guys for, you know, inviting us into the Hall of Fame, the Arizona Hall of Fame.
I learned
Look,
a lot
Mom,
today.
We made it.
Yeah, I learned a lot. It was
Cool,
really
man.
fun.
Good,
Really fun.
good. So did I. Well, had fun. I had fun,
Good.
definitely. And you know, it's neat. I'm glad that, you know, guys are doing this. You know, because and it's kind of one of the things about Phoenix. It's supportive of some of the arts in a way, you know. But it's nice to see that, you know, you guys are doing this. You know, tell Hans I appreciate it as well.
I will. He says hello. And
Good.
We're looking
Good.
forward to seeing you at your induction.
Cool. Yeah, it'll be fun.